Hello and welcome back to the channel. I am going to try and get another one of these videos done, which is part of the Gambling Low Ebbs series. I say a series, this is only the second one, so I don't know if you can technically call it a series whilst there's only one of them, but this will be the second instalment. Again, spoiler alert, it's not a happy story, it doesn't particularly go to a happy place, but it is an honest recollection of events that occurred, to me, around me, things that I brought upon myself in the early 1990s. This one in particular took place in July and August of 1994. If you have watched Gambling Low Ebbs Part 1, that dealt with a period of time between the back end of December 1993 and March 1994. This one is kind of set a little bit later than that in July and August of 1994. Please do remember that I'm doing all of this from memory. I've not really got any records from this time, so it is essentially from memory, but I did do a few little scribblings before to try and get my timeline right of which university I was at, what I was doing, which girlfriend I was with, that kind of thing. And little strange place markers that are burned into my head, like Nirvana's album In Utero, which was released in September of 1993. And I remember exactly where I was and where I was living when I bought that album, that kind of thing. So I'm fairly confident that I'm getting my dates right here, and I'm going to pitch this at July and August of 1994, which is actually after I had started going out with Mrs. Degsy. So me and the future Mrs. Degsy were actually an item by this point, but not by very much. We'd started going out in May of 1994. We've kind of picked, that thing when you're in a long-term relationship, you kind of pick a date, or when did we start going out together? And the date that we picked was my 20th birthday in May of 1994, when she bought me a pint at one of the Manchester clubs when we were just about starting to get a little bit romantically entangled. So we were an item. However, what happened is, in the summer of 1994, Mrs. Degsy went back to the Isle of Man because that was where she was from, and at that time, of course, I still lived in the UK. So we'd had a little bit of time together at the back end of the term, going up into the summer holidays in 1994. And this is, of course, bang in the middle of the worst of my gambling addiction years, which ran absolutely rampant through effectively a good chunk of the 1990s. So it was a fledgling relationship, and I can't lie, I was gambling like a bastard the whole time, but the relationship with Mrs. Degsy was starting to take flight. Basically, things were okay. Things were perhaps looking up a little bit. Here was a proper relationship with a lass that I was kind of falling head over heels with. It was a nice time, and I was due to start my second year at Manchester Metropolitan University in September of 1994, the same university that Mrs. Degsy was at, and I had arranged to move into a student house down in South Manchester. Because what had happened is I'd started at Manchester Metropolitan University, which I will abbreviate to MMU here on Ings. I'm not going to keep saying those three words. I had started at MMU in September of 1993. I actually started my university career at if you will, at Lancaster University, because I got pretty good A-levels, so I got into a decent university. I started at Lancaster in September of 1992, crashed and burned out of there in phenomenal style. That'll be a whole other thing. Bombed out after 3 months, went back to work for a few months, found myself a girlfriend down in Manchester, was working and living down in Manchester, and first came into the sort of the hemisphere of Mrs. Degsy, and then started again, had a second crack at university at MMU in September of 1993, and spent a little bit of time in a student house. But again, that was when the relationship with the girl that I mentioned in Gambling Low Ebbs Part 1 absolutely fell apart. I left that house and went back to live with my dad. And then in September of 1993, I started as a first year student, even though I was technically a year older than I should have been, at MMU, and then moved into this student house in September of 1994. And it was here, it was down in Furness Road in Fallowfield. It's kind of Studentville there. You know what, I can't honestly remember which one it was. They're all a bit samey. It was down this road here. It was actually not a bad student house. It was somewhere along here. I'd be lying if I could. I think it was over this first crossroads. Fucking hell, it'll be one of these down here. I've got it in my head. It was down right this end of Furness Road. So it will be one of those. Doesn't really matter. So what I'd done is, because I'd made some friends on the course that I was on, Mrs. Degsy was living in student halls, so I had arranged to move into this house, starting at the second year of MMU down in Furness Road, but things were getting a little bit ropey. Because after bombing out of Lancaster University, after one term, I had been back living at my dad's. I'd been working, I'd had a couple of different jobs, working all hours that I could to bring some money in. And then when I started MMU in September of 1993, there was still a student grant then, but they just introduced the student loans as well. And the idea was that as I got my student grant and my student loan, what I would do is give an amount of those to my dad to cover my sort of rent and keep at his house. And that wasn't happening, of course. I was in, this was full-blown gambling addiction mode at this time. I was periodically quitting, and like all kinds of the worst kinds of addicts, you'll quit and you'll say never again, it's taken me too far, gone too low, and then you'll start again. So my relationship with my dad had become increasingly strained, as money that I had supposed to be giving him towards my rent and my keep, the food in the house, the heat, the lecky, and all the rest of it, was not getting paid. So things have been getting a little bit strained between me and my dad. But one way or another, I had started up this relationship with Mrs. Degsy in May of 1994, and I was then looking towards my second year at MMU, and what I got into my head was that I wanted to move into this house with some friends that I had made on my course, and I didn't have the money for it. So I kind of talked to my dad about it, and he was saying, well don't be, because you had to put like quite a chunk of cash down. Even back then, we're going back to 1994, you had to put something like 700 quid down. It was like a month's rent up front and a month's rent as deposit. It was a chunk of cash. One way or the other, it was a chunk of cash, and I didn't really have the required cash, because even though I was working part-time at all times, I would work full-time during the holidays, because I was just gambling all the time, I basically had fuck all money the whole time. And my dad was saying, I don't understand, why do you want to move down into this student house? Just stay here living with me. All you need to do is pay your rent, pay your keep. It'll be a lot cheaper than living in a student house. You're at home, it's going to be dead easy to commute to university. You can just take the Metrolink, because the Metrolink was a fairly new thing then, but the Metrolink was up and running. I don't understand why you want to do this. And I've got to say, rather, because where did my dad live? My dad lived up in Radcliffe. There we are. So my dad lived in Radcliffe, and as you can, and the Metrolink runs effectively. The Metrolink starts, if you're not familiar with the Metrolink basically starts in Bury there and runs all the way right into Manchester, takes you right into the centre of Manchester. At the time, they hadn't extended it out as far as they have now, but right into the middle of Manchester, and then it's just a bus ride down to Manchester University and MMU, and my dad was saying, I don't understand why you want to do this. And the other thing, the stupidest thing of all, was not only was I committing myself to this this student house that I couldn't really afford to go to, I'd also got a full-time job over the summer holidays at a company called Broxap and Corby, who were based in Radcliffe, and they were actually down here down that lane, off Stand Lane in Radcliffe. You can just about see the building. That's the building that Broxap and Corby were in. And they kind of did street furniture, you know, like bollards and bins and benches and that kind of thing. And they were based in that building there in Radcliffe. So me dad's saying, what on earth is the plan here? You're already living in Radcliffe. You've got yourself a full-time job in Radcliffe, and you're committing yourself to move down to this student house during the summer holidays whilst you're working in Radcliffe, which you can't really afford. I don't understand why you want to go down there, and I didn't know either. If I'm honest, I can't really explain it. It was just that I was trying to run away from the addiction, is the only way that I can put it. I thought maybe a change of scenery, maybe a change of environment would change things for me gambling wise, which is, it's kind of an addicty sort of thing to do. You're looking for things to blame, anything that you know isn't you, effectively. And shamefully, in the end, I kind of twisted his arm a bit and said, look, Dad, this is really important to me. I need to go down to this house. I know it doesn't make much sense, but if you could help me out financially, you know, I'd really appreciate it, because it's something that I think is going to be good for me. And the thing is, my addictions at the time, drinking, drugs and gambling, were, I guess, apparent but not openly spoken about. And in the end, my dad basically lent me the money. It was, got it in my head, it was 600 or 700 quid, which was a good chunk of cash. He was a single parent. He had me and my brother, who he was still, you know, effectively supporting, and that was a large chunk of change for him to hand over. And I had to give that to the landlord ahead of time to secure my place in this student house, pay the deposit, and I think the way it goes is, and please do remember it's a long time ago, but I think you paid a reduced rent over the summer holidays, because of course most students wouldn't be in their houses over the holiday period, and certainly the summer holidays. So what you did was you secured the house with a deposit. You all had to pay a deposit, and then you paid like a nominal rent over the summer holiday period, and then the full rent would kick in at the start of September. And what the landlord of this property certainly said is, if you want to move in before, you know, the start of the term, you're welcome to do so. It doesn't really make any difference to us because you've already secured the property. So this awesome idea of mine ended up with me moving in to this house effectively by myself, and I'm gonna say it was in June or July of 1994. Mrs. Degsy was still on the Isle of Man. She was spending the summer with her family, so I was in here by myself for a period of time, and it didn't go well. Now, I'd been on one of my quit periods. It does happen periodically with this kind of thing, where you quit and swear off it and think, I'm never going to do it again. And I had managed to stay quit for a shortish period of time before moving into this house. I thought, you know, it's that whole change of scene, change of environment that I was talking about. I'll get into this house, I'll get my head together, I'll stop gambling. You don't want to be a fucking gambling junkie, fucking useless waste of space. You've got your new girlfriend who you're head over heels in love with. Let's not fuck this thing up. Let's have a change of scenery. Let's stop the gambling. Let's stop the bad behaviour. I mean, that's part of the thing that was readily available to me up in Bury, were attendant other things. You know, I knew all the right people to get anything that I wanted up in Bury, whereas down in Fallowfield I had no idea. So I thought it would be a clean break with some of my bad behaviours up in Radcliffe, and I'd commit myself to do the commute, to get to work every day. So that was how it went down. I moved into this house, got me stuff in, my dad ran me stuff down. I used the money that he'd lent me to pay the sort of deposit and the rent over the summer. And I was living in this house down on Furness Road, down in South Manchester, but my full-time job up in Radcliffe started. And it was a right fucking pain in the arse, because what I had to do was exactly the thing that my dad had been saying, this is insanity, why are you doing this? I had to get a bus. Basically, the bus went right up Wilmslow Road, which turns into Oxford Road, takes you right into the centre of Manchester, and then from Manchester, from Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester, you could then get from this, but it has changed, the topography has changed somewhat, but in essence, there was a bus that you could get. The buses are still basically in the same place. There was a bus that I could then take, I think it was the number 97, which when the bus services back then were magnificent, they really were. You could kind of get to anywhere in the entire of Manchester on a single fucking bus, it felt like. So it was a bus from Furness Road into the centre of Manchester, and then another bus that ended up actually dropping me off right outside Broxap and Corby in Radcliffe. And to tell you the truth, it didn't go well. I very, very quickly started to feel incredibly lonely because none of the other people who were living in the house had moved in. So I was kind of in this student house by myself in the middle of Studentville. So not only had none of my housemates moved in yet, but also the whole area was kind of dead because it was a student area and we're in the summer holidays. There were hardly any students there, so what was happening is I was having to get out of bed at kind of 6:30, 7 in the morning to get this first bus into the centre of Manchester and then another bus that would drop me off on Stand Lane here in Radcliffe so that I could get to work at Broxap and Corby here for 9 o'clock, and then after your basic kind of 9 to 5 day or 9 to half 5 day with an hour for lunch, I would then get the bus from this bus stop here, which is still in exactly the same place, get the bus from there, and that would then take me all the way back into the centre of Manchester, and then I'd get another bus that would take me down Oxford Road and back down to the house. And this very, very quickly didn't work for me. I'm not very good at being by myself, even though I can be quite a solitary character in a way. I need people around me. I don't like kind of solitude, as human beings don't really. So, and you've got to remember that this is pre-internet, this is pre-Facebook, this is pre-mobile phones. This is when phone calls, long-distance phone calls, were expensive. So what me and Mrs. Degsy were doing, we were writing each other letters and we were talking to each other on the phone when we could. But talking on the phone was fucking expensive. It really was. And we hadn't had the phone connected in the house down on Furness Road at that point. We had an electricity meter that you had to put money in. I had had the gas turned on, but I was waiting for the phone to be sort of activated. So it became very quickly a very lonely existence. There were these incredibly long days where I was getting up in the morning, 2 buses to get to work, a job that it was basically a sort of clerical job, administrative assistant. The pay was kind of okay, but I didn't find it interesting at all. And then I'd get the bus back, and then I'd go back to this sort of cold, empty, lonely house. I mean, it would have probably all panned out very differently if we would have had the technologies that we have today. If I could have FaceTimed or, video called Mrs. Degsy, it may have all panned out very differently. But I very, very quickly started to feel lonely and sad and depressed, and was kind of wishing that I was back at my dad's house in Radcliffe. But the problem was, because I'd pushed him so hard for that money, for the rent and the deposit to move into that house, it had kind of fractured us a little bit. I kind of turned the emotional thumbscrews on him, and he, against all logic, I pushed for it, and in the end he sort of, inverted commas, lent me the money for it. sort of against his will, really, because it was money that he couldn't afford, because he was absolutely breaking his fucking back at the gas board, and he knew full well that he wasn't getting this money back. And then once I'd started my job and started getting paid, of course, I was supposed to be then immediately starting, even if in fairly small chunks, to start paying that £600 or £700 back. But what I actually started doing after a short period of being quit, I started gambling again. And the problem is, once you break a quit cycle, certainly I always found that once you break a quit cycle, once you start doing the thing that you're not supposed to be doing, the thing that you know you're not supposed to be doing, the brakes are off then. You're kind of like, okay, it's fucked, I'm fucked up, let's do it properly. So this pub over the road here, you can see there how close it is. That's where I worked, down at Broxap and Corby in there. There we are, that building in there, that's where I worked. There's a pub right over the road. So if I had to wait for my bus, I'd be in there gambling. They had 2 fruit machines there. I'd be in there gambling whilst I was waiting for my bus. I also started gambling at the arcade, which was in the centre of Manchester, or any of the arcades that were in the centre of Manchester, to be honest with you. There is an arcade right in the centre of Manchester at Piccadilly Gardens. Seems to be a Nobles now. It wasn't a Nobles at the time, but that has been an arcade forever. And I'd swear to God, that arcade never seemed to shut. It was like it was open at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it was still open at midnight. I don't think they were 24 hours a day, but they can't have been far off. And I just went absolutely full bore crazy with the gambling again. Once the kind of loneliness of this life kicked in for me properly, and I turned to gambling again, I went nuts with it. Because you know what it's like with an addiction. It's always waiting there to welcome you back in. In fact, the more sad and lonely and miserable and depressed you are, the less things you have that you feel are sort of on your side, the more an addiction will tap you on the shoulder and go, come on, mate, me and you, it'll be all right. You know you want to. You'll enjoy it. Just do that thing that you want to do. You know you want to. Just have a little gamble. And from that first breaking of I'm not supposed to be gambling to gambling again, just went absolutely crazy with it. So very quickly burned through the small amount of money that I'd actually started to get together. You know, from not gambling, you save an awful lot of money when you cease to indulge your addiction. So by not gambling and the other bits and pieces that would go on up in Bury and Radcliffe, I'd saved a little bit of cash, as it were. That got burned through in no time whatsoever, and it got so bad that one morning I got the bus up to Piccadilly Gardens from the house, and I went into the arcade thinking, I've got 15 minutes, I can just have a gamble before my bus to work goes. Of course, missed my bus. And because it was like a special early morning service, it was like 2 hours until the next service that did the same route. And I found myself, I've been working at this place for maybe 2 weeks, and I find myself using a payphone at Piccadilly Gardens to ring up at 9 o'clock when they're opening, and I'm still at Piccadilly Gardens waiting for the second bus that will actually run this route, and making up some bullshit story. There's been a bomb scare. All the buses have been cancelled. They closed off the bus station. I'll get the next bus that I can out there. Don't worry, I won't be that late. Some absolute horse shit like that. I mean, it was kind of credible in a way. There were a lot of bomb scares back then because the IRA were blowing things up left, right and centre. But nonetheless, it's, I've been in this job for maybe a couple of weeks, and I'm ringing up and making excuses about bomb scares because I'm in the arcade playing fruit machines and missed my bus and then had to wait for the next one. And it kind of went downhill from there. Once I was gambling, I was really, really gambling. I didn't have particularly regular contact with Mrs. Degsy, bearing in mind that it was a very early relationship at that stage. So, we were we weren't like, massively attached to anything like that. It was the early stages of, when you tease each other out. So it was just writing letters, really. The main thing we were doing is writing letters to each other, because we weren't really like a full-on couple. We'd kind of been a thing in a way for a couple of months, really. So it all went downhill very, very quickly. And from being sort of, I'd say financially solvent, that might be stretching it a bit, but from having enough money to get by day to day and things being all right, I quickly found myself completely skint again, because I would just gamble and gamble and gamble the whole time. The other thing was that once I got back to where I lived, so Furness Road is just down there, there was this pub here. I think it was called the Queen of Hearts back in the day. It's called the Beer Studio now. Got it in my head it was called the Queen of Hearts. But you're right in the middle of Studentville here. There were pubs everywhere. There's a pub just over the road. You go down here, there were pubs down here. So there was just endless supplies of pubs and fruit machines. And I was right back on it. Any money that I had. That was a pub. It's always a cafe now, old farm. You get a coffee and things. That was a pub. There was just pubs all the way down here. You couldn't walk too far without finding yourself at a pub. That is still a pub there behind that bus. So yeah, that's a pub. Oh, that's new. Was that a pub maybe? You get the point. Within, a quarter of a mile of the front door was pubs. In the centre of Manchester was pubs. Right across the road from where I worked was a pub. So that means fruit machines everywhere. You've got arcades and you've got pubs, both of which of course had fruit machines up the wazoo, and I was playing them non-stop. And even if I won, I would quickly start losing again, of course, because I've said before that I would just play anything back then. Didn't matter what state it was in, didn't matter if it was on its arse or not. I had no discernment whatsoever. I would just play anything because I wanted to play fruit machines. Now that finished up about where you would imagine. I was already kind of crawling up the walls because I was in this house by myself. This kind of lonely house. I had nobody around me. I had no friends around me particularly. And I am full bore back into gambling as well. And I very, very quickly, essentially, ran out of money. And I mean ran out of money to the extent that I was starting to get hungry. I'd used all the money that I had available to me. I'd probably blagged a little bit of a temporary overdraft out of the bank in lieu of something or other. I'd blagged some money off work, small advance on my next pay pack because I needed to pay a bill. I even remember going round to my grandparents and blagging 20 quid off me granddad. Not the same granddad who died the other month. The granddad on my mum's side. I went round to their house and borrowed 20 quid on some fucking nonsense premise or other. Anything that I could do to get hold of some money, and it was just all going on fruit machines, walking into a pub, buying half a drink, losing the rest on fruit machines. I was just about managing to keep enough for my bus fare every day, because I knew that without the money for my bus fare I couldn't get to work and back, and I needed that to get money in the future. That was all. That was kind of, the bus fare was a way of guaranteeing more money to gamble with when I got paid at the end of the week. And it became, absolutely day to day scrabbling together enough money to get things to eat, to put a 50p piece in the electricity meter, and yeah, like I say, just scrabble around until I had money to gamble with again. I was selling things. There were loads of shops in Manchester where you could sell electronic goods and stuff like that. Sold me stereo, whatever it may have been. I kept a hold of my SNES, my Super Nintendo, and the telly, because I I knew I was not quite stupid enough to sell my SNES and my telly, because I knew that I needed my video games. They were the only thing that was just about keeping me on the right side of sane. But the wheels were coming dangerously close to coming off the wagon, and it just became this daily grind of getting up, bus to Manchester, bus to Radcliffe, go to work, bus back to Manchester, bus back to Furness Road in Fallowfield, rinse, wash, repeat, and just gamble any chance that I got. So I would go over to the pub in Radcliffe on my lunch break and gamble in there. I'd walk into Radcliffe town centre, gamble in the arcade there with whatever money I had, and it got so bad that I was getting genuinely hungry because I was neglecting to buy food. There was absolutely fuck all in the house. If you imagine, I'm in this house, it's for 4 people. They've split this house up into 4 bedrooms. They've got 2 upstairs, and they've turned 2 rooms downstairs into bedrooms as well. This house is supposed to have 4 people in it. I'm in there by myself. I'm reluctant to put money in the electricity meter. I'm increasingly feeling lonely and isolated, and it becomes it's a self-perpetuating cycle whereby the addiction is making you feel bad, but the only thing that can provide you temporary respite from feeling bad is the addiction. It just becomes a feedback loop. So it's, God, I feel like shit, I don't want to live like this. You know what? Gambling for a bit will take my mind off it. And then you gamble and you feel like shit, more so than you did the first time around or the millionth time around. So the only thing then that's got the emotional power to take your mind off it is to gamble again. And this went on. It wasn't a huge amount of time, I've got to be honest with you. I went downhill pretty fucking fast. Bear in mind that this is in the aftermath. We're only talking sort of maybe 3 months after Gambling Low Ebbs Part 1, where I fucking put myself in hospital sticking a knife into my fucking head. So it's not like I'd built myself up to some great status again. There wasn't very far to fall. And it got desperate. It got pretty desperate, and it got to the point where I was getting genuinely hungry. So one day I was at work and it was my lunch break. Basically, I had no money. I had bought my bus tickets for the day, and that was I had 68p in my pocket, and that was all the money in the world that I could lay my hands on. Not a single penny was available to me. And if you've ever been addicted to anything really, you will know that addicts are incredibly creative at managing to get hold of money. If there's one thing addicts are good at, it's blagging or finding creative ways to get hold of money. But I was out. I was absolutely tapped until my next pay packet came through, and that was a few days away. I was absolutely skint. All I had was the bus tickets to get back to my house. So what I did, out of desperation, out of genuinely feeling hungry, I came out of my lunch break. There's that pub just over the road, the New Bay, and what I did was I walked to my dad's house on Ainsworth Road. Up Ainsworth Road here, in this area here. I had a little check around the area to see if my dad was in, because you've got to remember that we had parted on very bad terms, because I was supposed to be paying him back this money that he had lent me to put down this sort of deposit and early rent on the house, and he hadn't seen a penny of it back. That was on top of the fact he was already annoyed with me because I'd kind of turned the thumb screws on him and getting that money on the first place, and on top of that I'd screwed him over on student grants and student loans that I was supposed to be turning over to him to cover my keep and my rent at his house. He hadn't seen a penny of that, so the relationship had become fractured. So as I went back to the house here on Ainsworth Road, I had a little look round to see if his gas van was there, because I couldn't face seeing him. I was so ashamed of the position that I was in that I was absolutely fucking skint. I was working full time. I was absolutely skint. I tapped out every last source of possible money I could find, and I was going back to the house, and I'll tell you why I was going back there. Effectively sneaking into the house during my lunch break and scoping out the streets nearby just to check that my dad's gas van wasn't parked up, because if he was working in the area he would go back to the house for his lunch. And I went in there looking for food. It was as simple as that. It was to get food. So I let myself into the house. He hadn't changed the locks or anything like that. By God, he'd been well within his rights to do so. Let myself into the house, went through to the kitchen and took some food out of the cupboards. I was genuinely fucking hungry. I was putting money in fruit machines ahead of buying food to eat. So I took some food, took a few bits and pieces, ate what I could in the house. I didn't really kind of prepare anything. I used a pan, and I took like a can or two with me and left quickly. Locked the door behind me. I basically went into my dad's house to steal food, if you will. Walked back to work, did the afternoon, got the bus back, and then did that for the next couple of days. I was getting money for the bus fare from somewhere. Managed to keep it up for about 3 days. I did exactly the same thing. Going back to this cold, empty, dark house. I had me telly, me Super Nintendo. It was terrestrial telly back then. You didn't need a satellite box or anything like that. It's just with an aerial you could pick up the basic 4 channels: BBC One, BBC Two, ITV and Channel 4. I always remember having the Big Breakfast on with Chris Evans, and was it Gabby Roslin? Remember having the Big Breakfast on before I left to get my bus in the morning. And then, because I was waiting for my next pay pack, every single day I would go back to my dad's house and I'd let myself in and I would take food, because that was the only way that I could eat. And it was I think it was on day 3 or day 4 of doing this. I went back to the house, let myself in, and went through to the kitchen. I did my usual little scoping around, making sure that my dad wasn't there, because I just couldn't face him. Can you imagine? I'm reduced to a fucking animal, basically. I'm just an animal scavenging for food. It's almost hard to explain how utterly addicted I was. My life was just gambling. It's pathetic, but it's true. And I just, to say that I had no self-esteem would be understatement of the century. I just, in Gambling Low Ebbs Part 1, where I looked at myself in the mirror and just basically wanted to destroy myself, it was like that again, but I was just running on some sort of basic feral instinct. So on day 3 or 4 of this kind of food hunt, effectively, I went into the house, let myself in, went through to the kitchen, and went through to the cupboards. Opened the cupboard looking for food, and it had changed in the cupboard. The contents of we had 2 cupboards in the kitchen that we kept our food in. It was kind of tins and dry goods in the bottom cupboard, and treaty, softy stuff and cakes and biscuits and whatnot in the middle cupboard. And what I've been doing is going into both of the cupboards and just picking a few, an item or 2 out of each. And as I went in and opened up the cupboards, the contents of both of the cupboards had changed, because there were, in both of the cupboards, there were things that I liked. There were the things that my dad knew that I liked, things that he wouldn't eat, because we had different tastes in food. And he'd stocked the cupboards up with things that I liked to eat. He knew that I was going back to the house, he knew that I was so fucking low that I was breaking in, letting myself into the house and taking food. And what he'd done is he'd gone out and bought and put things in the cupboards that he knew I would want to eat. So I'm stood in the kitchen looking at this, and on the one hand it did uplift me in a way, but the main thing that I felt was this overwhelming sense of just being a useless, pathetic cunt. Is this what you are? Is this what you're gonna be? You're having food left out for you because you'd rather gamble, you'd rather play fucking fruit machines than buy food. But I was hungry, so I took the food and went. And that carried on into the next week. I got paid, lost it all, just went out drinking. I had a little bit of money, you see, so I got paid, went out drinking and gambling. Lost the whole lot over a big fucking weekend, all by myself, down in this empty kind of student area down in Fallowfield. The pubs were dead, there was no nightlife, there was nothing going on. Going back to this empty house, just frankly sinking into a pit of absolute desperation. Picked it up again the next week. Same thing carried on. I was going back to the house. There were fresh things in the cupboards, things that I wanted, things that I liked to eat. I didn't have the courage, I couldn't bear to lose face to the extent to admit that I needed help. If I would have just asked my dad for help, he would have helped me. But I couldn't bring myself to admit it. I don't know why. And if there is a point to these videos, it's to say, if you think you need help, then ask for it. Do not try and do this the way that I did, because it will, if you're not as lucky as I was and you had family and friends and then Mrs. Degsy herself, a partner to look out for, you will fucking die. This thing will fucking kill you. So I didn't ask for help. My dad knew that he knew that he couldn't confront me about it, because I would effectively just run, I would deny, I wouldn't open up, I wouldn't talk. So he did the only thing that he thought that he could do, which was to leave food for me and avoid that confrontation. But then, I think it was the second day of the second week of this happening, it kind of reached a head for me again. I'd got paid, all my money had gone, I was absolutely skint again. I was down to just bus fare to and from work and then scavenging food from my dad's. So on the second day of the second week, basically when I came out of work, absolutely skint again. I'd had my bus tickets back and I couldn't face it. I just couldn't face going back to that house again. Going back to that house, the loneliness at this point had consumed me. I felt so desperately alone and so desperately miserable. The pathetic way that I was living my life, which was just bouncing from one. It's kind of, I guess in a way, it's kind of like a heroin addict would just live from one fix to another. My entire life was about when could I get enough money to be able to gamble for a small amount of time. Frankly, I decided I'd had enough. I came out of work on this day. I remember walking out onto this road here. Didn't have any money. If I'd have had some money, I'd have gone into the fucking pub here and gambled. I'd have bought, if I had a £10 note, I'd have gone into the pub, bought a half a Coke, and then gambled the rest away and then got the bus back, as I had done lost a lot of money in that pub, waiting for my bus with a half a Coke or an orange juice. So I came out of work on this day with absolutely fucking nothing. I'm working full time. I'm completely skint. I've got no one. I've got nobody around me. I've got no interest in having anyone around me because I'm just consumed by addiction. And finally, I just thought, I've had it. I've had enough. I'm done. I'm going to fucking throw myself in the river and be done with it. So my plan was, it's good to have a plan. I actually felt better for having a plan. What I was going to do was walk down Stan Lane, walk into the centre of Radcliffe, and throw myself off this bridge here. That was it. That was the plan. Now you'll see here that this bridge is not high enough. You're not going to fucking kill yourself jumping off this bridge. But it was... There's some rocks down below. It's high enough to make an impact. It was just a statement, really, of how fucking pathetic and how broken I was, that I thought, I'm just going to march down. That was genuinely, that was my idea. I'm going to march down this road here, and what I'm going to do is when I get to the bridge, I'm going to climb up on the side and just jump over the edge. And that'll be it. And we'll see what happens. And that was it. That was the plan. That was what I was going to do. So I started off walking down Stan Lane. The idea being, I'll get this far and chuck myself in the fucking river. But I didn't get that far. Because as I'm walking down the road here, as I went around one of these little swoops with the avowed intention, I'm going to get this far and throw myself into the river. As I walked round and got sight of the next stretch of road, there's a gas van parked by the side of the road. And in that gas van is sat my dad. I've seen him and he's seen me. So it's kind of, what you're going to do? You're going to keep walking. I could have just turned around and fled, but I thought, no, I'm going to keep walking. So as I got to the side of the gas van, the window was open, and my dad leans over and goes, "You all right there?" Yeah, I'm fine. I'm okay. And he says, "You don't look so good." I said, "Oh, it's just been a bad day, you know." And he's like, "How you doing?" "I'm all right, you know. Yeah, I'm okay." And I wasn't okay. Every fibre of my body was screaming. My body and mind was screaming, "You are not okay. You are so fucking far from okay. Just tell your dad how you feel. Tell him the fucking state that you're in." But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I don't know, just couldn't do it. So he's like, "Well, are you getting back?" Because this is the thing, I was going in the wrong direction. There was no reason for me to go in this direction. There was no reason for me to be on foot going in this direction. Even if I was going to try and walk back to the house I was living at, that was 100% in the wrong direction. And yet my dad was sat there in his van. How many days had he been sat there? How many days had he been doing that? Because he was waiting there for me. I knew that he knew how close to the edge I was. He already knew that his son is coming home during the day and scavenging for food. So he knew I was in a pretty fucking ropey place. And yet he still knew that he had to be there in his gas van. Maybe not on that day. Maybe that wasn't the first day that he'd done it. But he was there. But I still wouldn't open up. And he's like, "Okay, so are you getting back to your house now?" Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I get the bus back, yeah. And he's like, "Okay, do you need some money?" Oh, well, yeah, that'd be handy. I've not been paid this week yet, so yeah, that'd be really handy, thanks. So he reached into his pocket, into his gas board pocket, because he was what they call a craftsman mains layer. So the guy who he would work on putting medium pressure pipes under the roads and all, not like your domestic kind of your little pipes that come up and go into your gas meter, the proper stuff that runs down the middle of the roads, and if things get fucked up it can blow up entire streets. He had to get some serious qualifications to do the job that he did, to prove that he was competent to do it, and he understood, kind of the physics behind what he was doing. But it was a tough physical job, and he reached into the sort of pocket of his bright blue dirty gasboard jacket, because like I say, it was a tough physical job that he did, and he just reached in and pulled out a £20 note and said, there you go, just take that, it's alright. And I'm looking at this £20 note, and it's like I've won the fucking lottery. And I said, oh yeah, thanks very much. He said, yeah, no problem. Okay, you sure you're alright? Yeah, I'm just going to get back to the house now. Yeah, okay. Alright, well, you know where I am. Okay, thanks, see ya. It was very short. You've got to remember how there was some serious, I say bad blood, that's wrong, because there would never be bad blood between me dad and me, but we'd fallen out because of everything that I've talked about earlier in this video, and he drove off in his gas van, left me with this £20 note. So I've got a £20 note. This is enough money to get me through to payday. With this £20 note, I can go back up to here, I can get me bus, get back, because I've already got my bus tickets, remember. I can get back into Manchester, and then I can go back down to the house, and then there's loads of little like supermarkets and stores around there. I can buy some food, I can put money in the lecky meter, don't have to worry about that and using too much lecky. I can even treat myself to a pizza, and I've got enough cash to get me through to the next payday, because even after everything, my dad has given me a £20 note. And when you're that skint, and bearing in mind we're talking 24 years ago, £20 is a lot of cash. You can make that go a long way if you are sensible about it. So I did get my bus, got my bus from Radcliffe, which took me all the way back into the centre of Manchester, and then I got my bus from Manchester down to the house on Furness Road, and sat down and just felt like shit, thinking, what am I doing? What is my life? What am I achieving? I'm going nowhere. I'm doing nothing. You've got this wonderful new girlfriend on the Isle of Man who you're kind of now avoiding because it's you can't bring yourself to talk to her on the phone, and all you want to do is gamble. You can't talk to your own dad. And it was so isolating. It was so just dark. There was nobody around. All the houses around here were kind of student houses. The whole place was just so quiet. And I sat in this fucking house for 15-20 minutes with this £20 note, which was my last fucking shot in the world at that moment in time of getting through the next few days in some kind of decent state, and thought, I know what I'll do. I'll go and get a drink, and I'll just have a little gamble, just a few quid, not all of it, just a bit. So walked down the end of the road to the Queen of Hearts here, went in through that door there to the bar and said, right there mate, yeah, what can I get you? Half a Coke please. Okay, yeah, no problem. 85p whatever. Gave him the £20 note. Can I get the change in pound coins please? And he's like, what, all of it? Slight pause. Yeah, all of it. Okay, yeah, no problem. Coins out till. There you go. Oh, thank you. Went over to the machine. I remember what it was as well. It was a JPM Popeye. £6 jackpot JPM Popeye. I had £19 and 20p or whatever it was. The change from buying a half a Coke. Lost every single fucking penny. Every fucking penny. Didn't buy any food. Didn't buy a pizza. Didn't put any money in the lecky meter. Just lost the lot. Went back to the house. Sat in that same cold, empty house by myself. Got a knife from the kitchen and just kind of played around with it on my arms. Not like slashing them, just digging in, gently sort of slicing across the skin. Nothing too dramatic. It was just a way of feeling something, because at that point nothing could make me feel anything really. And pain was about the only thing that I felt worthwhile to feel. And then just got up in the morning and carried on doing exactly the same thing. I do remember though that because I was completely skint at that point, I literally had no money at all. Couldn't even get the bus fare. I then had to walk up into the centre of Manchester. It was doable on a walk. Walked up into the centre of Manchester and then just sneaked onto the Metrolink. The Metrolink would then take me as far as Whitefield, and then from Whitefield I could walk to where I worked. And from there I kind of lurched into the start of the term in September 1994. Once the term started, a couple of things happened. Of course, I got my student grant for the first term, and I could also apply for my student loan for that year. So there was a little infusion of cash, which kind of sort of kept the show on the road for a little bit. But of course, Mrs. Degsy was then back in Manchester as well, which helped an awful lot. That kind of gave me some kind of grounding again after getting over those, frankly, that dreadful. It was only a couple of months, this whole thing that I'm talking about here. It was probably, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, something like that. But honestly, it was one of the worst times of my life. I can never remember feeling quite as lonely and desolate and desperate as I did at that period of time. And I didn't last very long at that house. By the end of the first term, it was all over really, because I had no cash. I didn't have the money to pay the next block of rent, so it was a move back in with my dad job. He didn't bear any kind of grudge. We kind of patched things up enough for me to move back to his house in Radcliffe. They filled the space in my student house, and I did have my relationship, my sort of new relationship with Mrs. Degsy to focus on. So things picked up a little bit. There was that cash, there was the grant, there was the loan. I was working part-time, weekends and evenings when I could. So things kind of got, in a way, they actually got a little bit better after that period of time, which I would call, as per the title of the video, a real low ebb. It's one of those things. It's not a single event like Gambling Low Ebbs Part 1 was, but it's just a period of time when I remember being absolutely pummeled into the ground by my addiction, to the extent that I was reduced effectively to scavenging for food. Okay, so what is the point, if you will, of this video? Because there's got to be a point to it, hasn't there? Well, it's this kind of discussion here. This is just an example. There have been many of these over the years about all forms of gambling, not just at Casino Meister, but in many different venues. And it comes down to how much control and how much regulation should there be over gambling. What they're talking about here, and this is a debate that I've chipped in with in the past on my channel with Extra Chili, with its feature buy and feature gamble, is it okay to implement that sort of device or that sort of mechanic on an online slot or a physical machine? There are several positions that you can take in this argument, and you're going to find some people who will say all gambling should be banned, it doesn't serve any productive purpose whatsoever, it should simply be prohibited. You're going to get people on the extreme other end who should say anything goes, no regulation, no control, it's a free country and all that, let people do what they want. And the creators of these machines and slots should be able to do whatever they want. But in reality, most people come more towards the middle. There are people who prefer less regulation, people who prefer more regulation. So when it talks about the feature buy, this discussion here about the feature buy, we know that what that is. I've indulged in it myself on this channel. It's whereby you essentially pay a multiplication of the cost of your normal spin to buy a feature. So if your feature costs you 100 times your stake, you can have a pretty good guess that the average return of a feature is about 96.5 times your stake, which will make up for the house edge. Now, what's that got to do with fruit machines in Manchester in the early 90s? Well, it comes down to, what do we do in the way of control and regulation when it comes to gambling? Because I am not anti-gambling. These are not anti-gambling videos. I still gamble to this day. That is evident by the content on my channel, whereby I don't just cover fruit machines and fruit machine emulation of the past. I play them in the present, and I play online slots in the present. This is not about saying that gambling shouldn't be a thing or gambling should be illegal. The simple truth of the matter is that prohibition has never been the answer to anything. Let's see how that's worked out for drugs, for example, because that's been an absolute shit show. And when they try to prohibit alcohol in the United States, we all know how that one panned out. Kind of created serious organised crime overnight. As human beings, we have a desire to do certain things, and there's nothing wrong with that being allowed in a permissive and free society. But that is not to say that it's a bad idea to have checks and balances upon these things. I personally feel that fruit machines, the compensated UK AWP, is one of the most brilliantly pernicious designs in the history of mankind. These fuckers here, with not only the illusion of skill, but actual skill, whereby a player, if he's good enough or clued up enough or he's got the right information, can genuinely gain an edge and genuinely win over time, is one of the most compulsive and compelling mechanics that I think I have ever seen in the entire world of gambling as we know it. They are a unique proposition because they are compensated, because they are allowed to have these skill features or pseudo skill features in some cases, and amazingly they are available to children, whereby you can go to a seaside arcade. And how many adult fruit machine gamblers got their introduction on the kiddie versions because they're limited to a £5 jackpot, but as we all know, that £5 jackpot can repeat several times to make the jackpot substantially larger than that. So the point is that gambling per se, gambling overall, not necessarily an evil force, but it has to be regulated and it has to be controlled. I personally cannot think of any justification whatsoever other than people wanting to make money for gambling machines to be available to children. And if you want to go for the feature buy, why would you have the feature buy? It's a clear inducement to reckless gambling and people gambling beyond the limits that they feel safe at. And there are some really good posts in here. It's a good debate, as we often get over at Casino Meister. Where I would fall on this is gambling is okay. There's nothing wrong with gambling. There's nothing wrong with people wanting to have a gamble, but the idea that it shouldn't be regulated, that it shouldn't be controlled, and that anyone who has any kind of a problem with gambling only has themselves to blame. They should have better self-control and it's their own fault. That to me is abrogating our responsibility as a society to understand that certain things are inherently potentially harmful to quite large numbers of people, and it's about striking that balance between people's freedom to choose what they want to do and also protecting the interests of the population as a whole, and understanding that there is that balance to be struck, which is why, of course, many activities are restricted to adults and restricted in how they can be advertised and restricted in how we can indulge in them. That's all I'm kind of getting at here, and it's kind of based upon my own experiences and the experience of many others back in the early days of the Fruit Forums years and the MSN emulation community and Fruit Machine emulation, when a lot of us came together for the first time and started to share our stories. It becomes obvious how catastrophically addictive forms of gambling can be, and I do sometimes wonder if I hadn't have had my family and my friends and, of course, Mrs. Degsy, what would have happened to me? I'd have probably been dead. I'd have almost certainly been dead. Or if I hadn't have actually died, I'd just be this hollow fucking husk, this hollow shell lurching from one day, from 1 week and 1 month to the next. And then that gets me thinking about what happened to those people. What happened to those people who weren't as lucky as I was, because there was a good number of years, frankly, where I wasn't really capable of looking out for myself and other people did it for me. Now, the brutal answer to that may be, well, whatever, you should have fucking died then. Done the world a favour. Okay, that's a point of view, I suppose. I like to be more compassionate about that. Where I see addiction, where I see an addict, I feel compassion and think, I wonder what we can do to help that person. Is there something about the system that we can change? Is there something that we allow to happen that maybe we should consider changing to reduce the chances of this happening? It's not a binary choice. It's not all gambling or no gambling. It's about finding somewhere in the middle that works in a responsible manner. And I guess, if anything, this video is about explaining why I am on the side of the fence where I am very much in favour of strong and responsible regulation when it comes to gambling. Very, very simple slam dunk here. Fruit machines should not be playable by anyone under the age of 18 at all. I don't care how small the jackpot is, it just should not be allowed. It should be illegal for anyone to cite a fruit machine and have it played by children. Simple as that. Adults only. And I'd come down on the same side of that when it comes to buying features. Just outlaw it. There's no reason for feature buys to exist, in my opinion. It's the wrong side of the fence. It's the irresponsible side of the fence. It's just about making money and not caring about how the fuck you do it. So I believe that that is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll catch up with you next time. But for now, goodbye.